Hello. In this short video, I wanted to add a small amount of emphasis to a couple of elements of this unit, which may act as a sort of counterbalance to what are perhaps easily reached conclusions about social and public policy making, and factors that are fundamental to and influence such processes. I think the focus of this video can be summarised into three main points, which are acknowledging the limitations of the notion of a policy cycle, recognising that policy making is a complex process, and finally understanding that history and politics still matter. So I think we can agree that none of those three statements are particularly contentious, but I also think that with a little more explanation and thought, it may help uncover why they are key to this module in particular, and your programme more generally. So firstly, the limitations of the policy cycle. It is always worth remembering that the policy cycle is simply an heuristic or illustrative device to help us more easily conceptualise the policy process, and it shouldn't be thought of as a prescriptive process. As you will be aware from the material in this unit, the policy process is messy and complex, so a simple illustration can be helpful to enable us to begin to get a handle on how and why policy develops. However, the policy cycle describes a rather linear and simple process in which each stage informs the next until we get to evaluation, which then restarts the cycle again. In reality, policy development and reform can be initiated at different stages of the cycle and can appear to work in a stop-start or at times backward fashion. The stages in the policy cycle can and do overlap, and so whilst policy cycle is helpful in describing a simple process, we shouldn't try to push this simple conceptualisation too far and consider it as representative of genuine complexity of policy development and reform. Secondly, we can all agree that policy making is a complex process, and this complexity has developed and evolved as both internal and external factors and influences have helped shape the policy development process of individual states and more broadly regional and global institutions. As the process of policy has shifted away from a paternalistic top-down approach in which the state or government was the main actor, both initiating and delivering policy, and towards a more multi-acted, multi-layered process in which organisations and networks outside of what was traditionally thought of as the state influence and direct policy reform and development. Globalisation and the rise of the competition state can be seen as examples of how such complexity has increased as states take greater account of economic policy in response to external actors and economic threats. And this then informs how and why social policy is developed and implemented. So at a basic level, the individual states are in economic competition with each other, and this impacts upon how and why policy reform takes place, the range of actors and organisations involved in the policy development, as well as issues policy seeks to address, and the outcomes social policy can hope to achieve. So we've shifted away from a relatively simple model of policy making by the state to one in which the state can be viewed as one of a range of actors or interested parties which aim to use policy to address competing issues or pressures and achieve identifiable policy goals or outcomes. It is for this reason that this module and the programme more generally emphasise a multi-layered or multi-level approach to policy analysis to help us take account of this increased complexity and better understand the environment in which policy is developed and how and why policy may succeed or fail. And the final point I want to emphasise is that both politics and history still matter. Politics clearly matters, as despite noting the increased range of actors in the policy process at a domestic or national level, it is still governments who enact policy and who gain plaudits or brickbats depending on whether policy is deemed a success or failure. Politics also matters as it's clear that policy is driven by ideology. And a clear example of this in a UK context is the shift away from a societal or collective approach to issues or problems and towards one which promotes policies which require an individual response. On a broader level, this mirrors the decline of social democratic politics and the rise of neoliberalism in the latter half of the 20th century. That said, however, history also matters in terms of policy process, as it can be very difficult to radically alter existing policies, at least in the short term. Here, the concept of path dependency is helpful, as it describes how current policy is both a reflection of and can be constrained by what has gone before. One area of policy which is particularly path dependent or sticky is pensions policy. For illustrative purposes only, if we think of there being three main approaches to pensions policy: a state-provided pension financed via general taxation, a market-based individual approach financed through individual purchases and investments, and a simple savings mechanism such as a provident fund. Try changing any of them radically and you will immediately come up against opposition. So, for example, to radically alter the state pension, you need to convince individuals to spend more on a private pension in addition to their tax contributions. To underpin the market-based approach with an additional state pension, regardless of its generosity or meanness, you need to convince individuals to increase their tax bill in addition to the cost of funding their personal pension. In the case of a simple savings account, again, you need to increase the burden on individuals to fund any alternative. Each policy is hemmed in by its history, by its appeal to an electorate or the lack of appeal of any alternative. It's easier to provide new goods and services to an electorate than it is to change or remove existing provision. Policy reform can and does take place, but as a result of path dependency, it's more often incremental and piecemeal rather than radical. And we'll find out more about the impact of political power and incrementalism in the next 2 units.